So the psychology of climate change in 20 minutes will be a bit challenging, so I'm going to try and just select a few topics that might be of interest. And I want to talk about what psychology can tell us about why people don't get involved in thinking about living more sustainably. To tell you a little bit about what we do understand about people taking up the ideas around sustainability and what that means for us here. But the first thing is I need to issue a warning to some of the engineers in the audience. We'll be talking a little bit about feelings, so brace yourselves. So let's pick up the idea of people not engaging with climate change, not engaging with the idea of sustainability. I want to put a quote from H.G. Wells. So in his fantastic novel from the 19th century, the War of the Worlds. So the scene is the Martians have invaded, they're killing people in Surrey, people are dying around them, but the narrator and the artilleryman are hiding out in a house, they're playing cards, they're playing chess. And the narrator says this: so beautifully put, strange mind of man that with our species upon the edge of extermination we could sit playing. And you think actually for those of us engaged in sustainability, it's often the way we see the world. If we update the ideas of the activities from chess and cards to watching Love Island or tweeting, it seems that people are going on with their everyday lives as if nothing much is happening, and we might be feeling, why aren't people out in the streets saying we must change, things must change, we can't go on the way we are. So there are different answers, different ideas in psychology which can explain a little of this, but there's a big aspect of that is that of threat. So the idea of climate change and global warming creating a threat to people, there's obviously the existential threat, the threat to existence. So the idea that the changing climate might bring injury or even death to ourselves or our loved ones. The idea that it could wipe out swathes of the Bangladeshi population through rising sea levels. The idea that humanity as we know it might actually stop and come to an end. So it's very substantial change. The interesting aspect of threat, though, from a psychological point of view is it's not only about the physical threat, the existential threat. The idea of a more sustainable world is in itself threatening to people. The idea, touched on by John, of a world in which there's more and the commons become stronger, where energy is no longer in the hands of large corporations and their investors, and that through renewables the sources of energy and a lot of wealth is more equitably spread. The idea of a sustainable world where the level of consumption we now enjoy is radically less. The idea of a sustainable world where flying is no longer treated as a very regular occurrence by millions of middle-class people around the world. So these bring threats to people, very fundamental threats. There are threats to people's lifestyles, obviously, the suggestion that we can't go on the way we are. There are threats as well to people's values. Now, from a psychological point of view, we understand values to be the guiding principles that that help to guide people's actions. So they tend to be our values tend to be the way we think things should be, and it's the way that we want to act. And in understanding people's values, and there's been a lot of empirical work on this in many countries, we understand a cluster of values around materialism and wealth and status and achievement. And for some people, that's how they see the world. It's important to them to accumulate wealth because that's how they see the way life should be lived. So the idea of a more sustainable world in which wealth isn't something we can all pursue to that level is quite threatening in a fundamental way. The idea of a worldview follows on from values, and it's an idea of a pattern of beliefs that how people understand the world, how they find meaning of their place in the world. The way they think, say, things should be, the right way to do things. And the idea of a very changed world for some people is fundamentally threatening. So if that pattern is overturned, it means where do they find meaning? So in some ways and for some people, the idea of a more sustainable world forms a threat. In psychology then, the idea of threat brings forward a response in the form of defense mechanisms. Now, defense mechanisms date back to good old Sigmund Freud, who started some of the thinking in this area. But in more recent times, scholars like Rosemary Randall, Sally Weintraub, Paul Hoggett, are people who have updated those ideas, and particularly how they might relate to climate change and the threat that brings. So there are many defence mechanisms. I'm just going to talk about a few of these. The classic defence mechanisms, I'm sure you'll be familiar with, is that of denial. So plenty of evidence how the idea of denying that there is a threat from the warming climate is a way to avoid having to deal with it. Wishful thinking is another defence mechanism. The idea that for people who say, well, there will be technological solutions, it will happen, they will be scalable, they will happen quickly, and they'll happen in time, the problem is solved. And where we might see that quite commonly in Europe, in the US, there's also a number of people who believe that God will solve the problem for them. So in both cases, from a psychological point of view, it's a mechanism in which people are saying something external to me is going to solve this. I don't have to do anything, I don't have to deal with it, it will be solved. Another mechanism is compartmentalisation, and here it's a mechanism in which there might be times or places where people don't deal with the problem. So they might deal with it at work, but not deal with it at home, for example. Now, defence mechanisms are essential ways that our minds work. So in the same way that our skin protects the body from bacterial infection or injury, the defence mechanisms protect the mind, the psyche, the self from threat. And there are ways in which we succeed in coping with the world and thriving in the world. So they're very important, they're often unconscious, they're a natural part of all our makeup. The problem comes when they are dysfunctional in the sense of they don't help us to deal with the threat, when they work in a way that actually prevent us from engaging with the threat and doing something about it. Now, we in this room have, I think, a common interest in a more sustainable world from different perspectives. But we also are people dealing with the threat. And I think that in some ways the threat can be more real to us, can impact on us more than the general population. When we think about the threat to us, the threat to our lifestyle is the same. We also, I think, sometimes will realise that we can't get the next iPhone the minute it comes out because that's not consistent with the more sustainable world. We're in social systems, particularly in academia, I think, where our professional life is also can be incentivised by quite unsustainable practices. So we know that there can be a lot of encouragement to take long-haul flights to conferences, to collaborate, but to actually physically go to collaborate. So there are disincentives there, and to suggest that we might need to do things differently does actually challenge our professional practice and advancement. But I think as well that the existential threat to us can be greater than the general population. Because I think that in what we do, for many of us, we're reading the latest climate science, we're seeing the predictions. And I guess I'm not the only person in the room who might have read a paper from time to time and gone, we're doomed. You know, you feel that the threat from what's there, and I'm seeing some nodding heads around. It almost, I think, gives us a ringside seat on that edge of extermination that H.G. Wells talked about. So we understand more than the average person what is going on and what the future may hold. And that size of threat brings with it very negative emotions, and quite reasonably for the size of threat. So we might feel fear or anxiety. We might feel even despair or helplessness or depression. And these are, as I say, very rational feelings in response to the size of the threat we deal with. But in my experience, we don't tend to talk about this, we don't acknowledge this, that actually we do deal with these on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And we do, I think, for most of us, most of the time, we deal with it pretty successfully. But we don't talk about it, we don't acknowledge it. So I wanted to take the opportunity to say, actually, it's valuable to say that we do experience these, we are dealing with these negative emotions, and put it out there to say, well, maybe we should talk about them from time to time if we need to. So I'm going to move on from that point to talk a little bit about why people do engage with sustainability and some of the factors that allow people to consider alternative ways of living, to get involved, to be activists, or take action in various forms. So quite a number of factors are known. I'm going to just pick out a few to talk about. Now I'll come back to this idea of values. So I talked about some people who have a cluster of values around wealth and status. And at the other end of that dimension, there are values around the idea of what we call a self-transcendental cluster. Not easy for me to say. The idea that for some people, the idea of learning and improving themselves is important. Altruism important, social justice, often love of nature or looking after the environment. These are a cluster of values, and for people for whom these kind of values are important, then understanding where sustainability, a more sustainable world might take us and where we might need to go is something that fits with their values. It's something they're more likely to get on board with, to get involved with. Another factor is motivation. Now, psychologically speaking, motivation is, if you like, the driving force of behaviour. It's what gets us to actually do something, to act in a particular way, and it determines how long we'll get engaged with that action, how much we persist. And we understand that we can have extrinsic motivations. So, extrinsic motivations typically have got to do with maybe finance, so if people are paid to do something, or if there's regulations or a sort of a negative incentive. We know that extrinsic motivations do work. People will act in the way that they're told to. Excellent. So we know that if we pay people or if we give them financial incentives, people's behaviour will tend to go along with that. Or if we penalise them and say that there will be fines or there's a regulation that says you shouldn't do it, behaviour will follow. But it tends to be that individuals feel somewhat controlled. They're doing it not because they want to, they're doing it because somebody outside of them has said, you need to do this. So the behaviour will persist, but only when the external factors are there. On the other hand, there are internalised drives that motivate much of what we do. So we tend to be quite happy to do things where there is fun and enjoyment in doing it, or where it's part of how we see ourselves, if it aligns with who we see ourselves as being, or if we believe we have a personal responsibility or it's morally right to do it. These type of drives and motivations are internalised, and what it means is that we're more likely to undertake that kind of behaviour over the long term, independent of what's going on around us, and we're more likely to persist, to overcome challenges, to work like that. So where we can find opportunities for internalising motivation, it's a much stronger mechanism for people to behave in a particular way or to change their behaviour. And social norms. And this is a really interesting one, because in psychological work, when we ask people about why they do things, the number of people who will admit they do things because other people do it is very small. But we have ample statistical evidence that actually it is a very significant factor in why we do things. And it makes sense, because we're social creatures. We are very much attuned to what other people do. It's really the way society works, because we tend to go along with what other people do. We don't have to, we can decide not to. But most of the time, most of us will do as others do. So it is a strong influence on what we do. And we understand within social norms we can have injunctive norms, which are kind of the rules, we think, written or unwritten, of what we do. And we also have descriptive norms, and that's what we think, and that's what we believe other people are doing. So here we've got opportunities where if there's a tipping point in behaviour where it becomes the norm for people to do something, that will bring others along with them. But social norms are interesting because it's not necessarily the biggest number of people. The people around us, our in-groups, are particularly important. So there's opportunities there to, as I say, bring people along in behaviour change. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about what does that mean for us. We've got a community here of researchers, of educationists, of business people, with an interest in sustainability, and I think it's worth remembering that we are communicators and we are influencers. Despite the talk of too many experts, there's still good evidence that people do tend to trust scientists, and they do expect business people to be authorities on the product or service that they're offering. From the psychology of communication, we know there are better and worse ways of trying to convince or influence people. And we know that particularly trying to gain common ground with people is really important. So understanding the fact that the people we're dealing with will not necessarily share our worldview, and it could be a radically different one from ours, but there still can be common ground that for people, some people will not be interested in mitigating emissions, they're not interested in the issue of climate change, but they may well be interested in health issues, they may well be interested in the future for their children, or a love of nature. Interestingly, in the US, there is a strong love of nature within Republican supporters because hunting and fishing is very important. So it's an interesting one where they might not agree on particular topics, but there is common ground. We know that stories are stronger than facts, that for most of us we like to have the facts, we feel we must have those before we can talk. But actually facts don't convince. Stories are things that people relate to, it engages people, and there's a lot of understanding of actually that's how human knowledge has evolved. It's through telling each other stories. If the stories can be about people, so much better. Visual imagery particularly strong. And of course, an example sort of par excellence of successful communication is the Blue Planet 2 effect. And so we had David Attenborough as a well-recognised expert presenting a story, almost the story of the creatures with fantastic visuals. And in one episode, he got the issue of ocean plastics, which has been around for 30, 40, 50 years. He got it onto the agenda across the world. So in the UK, it's the Environment Secretary is talking about it, and it's now socially acceptable to say, I don't want a plastic straw or a single-use cup. So one episode, and there was a turning point, which is a fantastic example, and we can't hope to do that, but it's wonderful to know that actually with the highly skilled communicators, the way it can work, and we all also are communicators in our small way. So how do we sustain ourselves? So coming back to that question of the negative emotions and the impact on us, I'll come back to the idea of compartmentalisation. So that's a defence mechanism that actually can work when it's used not as a means of avoiding action. So the idea that it is quite reasonable to engage with what needs to be done in some parts of your life, and maybe then there might be times to put down the burden, to just enjoy life. Because if in doing that, that helps you to cope better, to work better, it's an effective defence mechanism. Social support, really important. So the idea of friends and family and just enjoying people's company, massively important in sustaining ourselves. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that if the negative emotions that we do deal with, however successfully, sometimes they become a heavy burden, if they get in the way of enjoying life or getting on with work, talking to people is important. And there is professional help now. There are counsellors who are beginning to specialise in climate change anxiety. So if anybody does have issues where it does become a problem, do seek professional help, because what you're feeling is a rational response to the work you do. Alongside the negative emotions, I think we can harness positive emotions to sustain us, to help us go forward. So we certainly have hope on many counts. A few of the things that give me hope are the idea that every country in the world, bar 3, has signed up to the Paris Agreement. That New York City is now divesting from fossil fuels, and they're also suing some of the fossil fuel corporations for damages, which I think is quite nice. And also that Ireland is the first nation in the world that has decided nationally to divest from fossil fuels, which is fantastic and a real sign of leadership. The falling power of renewables. I think every day we see news, progress, reasons for hope in what we do. Gratitude is another important positive emotion, and here I think we can feel very grateful to Lloyd, to Chris Gorse and their teams for the work they've done in bringing us together here and in previous years at Scenes. And I think also we can feel grateful for all of us here, because everybody here is applying some of their intellect, effort, time in trying to look for progress on sustainability. and I think a sense of gratitude for the people we work with. We're actually part of a community globally where there are tens of thousands of academics who work in this area, tens of thousands of educationalists, hundreds of thousands of business people who are engaged in looking for progress, and put that together with the millions who have come out in the streets at various times to say, actually, we do need change. So we're part of a bigger community, and I personally feel enormously grateful for that. So I'll come to the last point of what we might do for sustaining ourselves, and it's the mechanism that's the most effective psychologically when faced with threat, and that is, of course, to act to mitigate the threat. And that is what you're doing in the work you do. So please continue to do that, because it's good for you psychologically as well as good for humanity. So I'll leave it there. I've just talked about some of the aspects of trying to understand how we as people are dealing with this enormous threat that faces humanity. Knowing that for some people the threat is such that they can't actually deal with it. But that there are ways in which we can, if you like, work around that to engage them in ways that they are happy to be, to come along and to change. But also to say it's important to sustain ourselves. We do deal with that negative impact as well as the work we do. So recognising that is important, and there are ways that we can gain support. But particularly in the work you do, enormously valuable. And I'll just leave it there and say enjoy the rest of the day, and Gur Mil Mach Riamh.